Have you ever opened your front door to find police officers standing there? Not because you did anything wrong, but because someone wanted you gone. My name is Stephen Caldwell. I am 67 years old. I moved to Willowbrook Estates seeking peace after 35 years as a federal judge. I was not looking for trouble, but trouble found me in the form of a woman named Patricia Vaughn, president of the neighborhood HOA. She called the cops to my house with fabricated accusations. She had no idea who I was. And when those two officers recognized the man standing in front of them, I watched the blood drain from their faces in an instant. If you have ever had someone abuse their power to destroy your dignity, this story is for you. Stay until the end. 7:03 on a Sunday morning. I remember the exact time because I had just poured my first cup of coffee and glanced at the clock on the microwave. The house was quiet, the way I liked it. I had moved to Willowbrook Estates 8 months ago, after my wife passed and the empty rooms of our old house became unbearable. This was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to read, to garden, to exist without the weight of the world pressing down on me. I should have known better. Peace, I have learned, is not something you find. It is something others allow you to have. And in this neighborhood, one woman had decided I did not deserve it. The doorbell shattered the morning like a gunshot. I set down my coffee and walked to the front door, expecting perhaps a lost delivery driver or a neighbor with a misdelivered package. What I found instead were two police officers in full uniform, their body cameras blinking red, their faces arranged in that particular expression of professional seriousness that I had seen 1,000 times from the bench. Behind them, standing on my walkway with her arms crossed and a smile that could only be described as triumphant, was Patricia Vaughn. Patty, as she insisted everyone call her, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association for 6 consecutive terms. The woman had built her little kingdom on the assumption that her word was law in this community. I opened the door fully and stepped into the frame. The younger officer, whose nameplate read Santos, looked up at me. I watched his face change. It was subtle at first, a flicker of recognition, then confusion, then something close to alarm. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that I thought he might be ill. His partner noticed nothing, already consulting a small notepad, but Officer Santos knew exactly who I was. 5 years ago, he had testified in my courtroom during a civil rights case involving excessive force. I had ruled in favor of the plaintiff. He had been one of the few officers who thanked me afterward and said the department needed accountability. Now, here he was, standing on my porch because a woman had called 911 with lies. Mr. Caldwell, the older officer began, we received a complaint regarding an incident at a homeowners association meeting last week. The complainant alleges that you engaged in harassment and made threatening statements toward board members. He paused, glancing back at Patricia, who nodded vigorously. She further alleges that you threatened her with physical harm. I said nothing. I have learned, after decades in the legal system, that silence is the most powerful tool available to an innocent man. Let the accuser fill the void. Let them hang themselves with their own words. Patricia could not resist. I have witnesses, she announced, stepping closer. Multiple residents heard him threaten me. He said he would make me regret ever crossing him. He was aggressive, intimidating. I still fear for my safety. This man is dangerous. Officers, I want him arrested. Officer Santos shifted his weight. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how to handle this situation without making it worse. His body camera was recording everything. So was his partner's. Every word Patricia spoke was being preserved in digital amber, and she had no idea what she was doing to herself. Ma'am, Santos said carefully, we need to establish some facts first. Mr. Caldwell, can you confirm whether you attended the HOA meeting last Thursday evening? I reached into my pocket slowly, deliberately, and produced my phone. I was in Portland, Oregon, last Thursday. I flew back Friday morning. I pulled up my boarding pass, still saved in my email, and showed it to him. United Airlines, Flight 472, landed at LAX at 11:47 a.m. I have the receipt from the airport parking garage as well, if you need it. The silence that followed was exquisite. I watched Patricia's face cycle through confusion, then denial, then the first flicker of fear. She had not expected this. She had expected me to stammer, to deny, to argue. She had expected the police to take her side, the way they always did. That's not possible, she said. He was there. People saw him. Which people? I asked. My voice was calm. I had interrogated witnesses for 35 years. I knew how to ask a question that had no good answer. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Officer Santos was already backing away from the situation, his hand moving subtly to adjust his camera angle. He wanted to make sure everything was captured. Smart man. He understood what was happening, even if his partner did not. "We'll need to verify this information," the older officer said, his tone shifting. "Mr. Caldwell, we apologize for the disturbance. Ma'am, we'll be in touch." They left. Patricia stood on my walkway for a long moment, staring at me with something new in her eyes. Not triumph anymore, something harder, something that told me this was not over. I closed the door and walked back to my coffee. It had gone cold. I poured it out and made a fresh cup, then sat at my kitchen table and looked at the stack of papers I had been collecting since my second month here, when the first violation notice arrived for a garage door that was, according to Patricia, the wrong shade of beige, violation notices, fines, threatening letters about my trash can placement, my landscaping choices, and the height of my hedges, each one more absurd than the last. Each one was signed by Patricia Vaughn. I had thought these were just the petty grievances of a small-minded woman with too much time on her hands. I had been wrong. This was not harassment. This was a campaign, systematic, deliberate, designed to drive me out. And Patricia Vaughn had just made the worst mistake of her life. To understand what happened that Sunday morning, you need to understand the 8 months that came before it. When I first arrived at Willowbrook Estates, I thought I had found exactly what I was looking for. The houses were well maintained, the streets were quiet, and the neighbors seemed friendly enough. The real estate agent mentioned the homeowners association almost as an afterthought, just a small fee, she said, to keep the community looking nice. She did not mention Patricia Vaughn. She did not mention that this neighborhood operated less like a community and more like a fiefdom. With one woman sitting on the throne, I signed the papers, moved in my boxes, and waited for my new life to begin. The first violation notice arrived 3 weeks later. The letter informed me that my garage door was the wrong color. Not dramatically wrong, not red or purple or covered in graffiti, but approximately 2 shades darker than the approved beige specified in Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the Community Covenants. I checked the CC&Rs myself, the thick document I had skimmed before purchase. My garage door fell well within the acceptable range. I wrote a polite response explaining this, attached photographs and paint samples, and mailed it to the HOA office. 2 weeks later, I received a fine of $75. No explanation, no acknowledgement of my evidence, just a payment slip and a warning that failure to comply would result in additional penalties. That was January. By June, I had accumulated a folder thick with similar notices, parking infractions in my own garage, landscaping complaints about professionally maintained beds, citations for trash can placement, and hedge height measured by someone with a tape measure and far too much free time. I attended exactly 1 HOA meeting during those 8 months. I wanted to see how the system worked, to understand who I was dealing with before deciding how to respond. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a Wednesday evening, and perhaps 40 residents showed up, a small fraction of the neighborhood, but enough to fill the folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Patricia Vaughn sat at the front table with 4 other board members, a microphone in front of her and a stack of papers at her elbow. She controlled the room with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years. Motions were proposed and seconded within seconds, passing unanimously because no one dared raise a hand in objection. Questions from residents were acknowledged with thin smiles and non-answers. I watched one elderly man stand up to ask about a drainage issue that had been flooding his backyard for 2 years. Patricia thanked him for his concern and promised to look into it. The way she said it made it clear that nothing would be done. I sat in the back row and said nothing. I was gathering information, not making enemies. But Patricia noticed me anyway. Her eyes found mine across the room and lingered there, evaluating, calculating. I saw her write something on her notepad, and I knew then that I had been marked. The true scope of Patricia's power became clear to me only gradually. pieced together over months of quiet observation and careful questions to neighbors who would speak candidly. Her husband, Gregory Vaughn, owned a property management company that handled several communities in the area, including, I discovered, the contracted management services for Willowbrook Estates. 3 of the 5 board members were either related to Patricia or owed her favors. Her sister served as secretary, her college roommate as treasurer, and a neighbor whose son Patricia had helped get into a private school as the at-large member. The 5th board member, a retired accountant named Brenda Gray, rarely spoke at meetings and seemed to exist primarily to provide the appearance of independence. Patricia had also cultivated relationships with the local police through the Neighborhood Watch program she had founded and chaired. Officers knew her by name. They attended her annual block party. When she called to report a disturbance, they came quickly, and they came ready to believe her. I learned something else. 2. Residents who had challenged Patricia in the past did not fare well. One family had tried to sue the HOA over selective enforcement of the rules. The lawsuit dragged on for 18 months, cost them over $40,000 in legal fees, and ended in a settlement that required them to sell their home and leave the community. Another resident, a young attorney who had questioned the HOA's financial practices at a meeting, found himself buried in violation notices until he, too, moved away. The message was clear. Fighting her was expensive, exhausting, and ultimately futile. I understood why people kept their heads down. I understood why no one spoke up. The week after the police visited my home, I found an envelope tucked under my doormat, no return address, no stamp hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. I have lived here 12 years, no one beats her, but last year, they raised the fees by 40%. No one knows where the money went. Be careful. Below the note was a photocopy of HOA meeting minutes from 3 years ago. I almost set it aside, assuming it was just another piece of the bureaucratic puzzle I was assembling. Then I saw the line item that made me stop. Reserve fund transfer, $127,000, approved for infrastructure improvements. I walked to my computer and pulled up satellite imagery of the neighborhood, scrolling through historical photos going back 5 years. The streets were the same, the sidewalks were the same, the clubhouse, the pool, the common areas, nothing had changed. $127,000 had been approved for improvements that did not exist, and I was beginning to understand exactly where that money might have gone. I spent the first 3 days after the police visit doing nothing, or rather, doing nothing that Patricia Vaughn could see. I went about my routine morning coffee, afternoon walks, quiet evenings with a book, while she no doubt waited for my next move. Would I storm into her office demanding answers? Would I hire a lawyer and threaten a lawsuit? Would I sell my house and disappear like the others before me? I did none of those things. I had learned long ago, in courtrooms where fortunes and freedoms hung in the balance, that the person who moves first often moves wrong. And I had decided that if Patricia Vaughn wanted a war, I would give her one, but on my terms, on my timeline, and with weapons she did not know I possessed. The first weapon was knowledge. I spent hours at my kitchen table with my laptop open, navigating the labyrinth of California civil code. The Davis-Sterling Common Interest Development Act governs homeowners associations in this state, and it is a dense, technical document that most residents never bother to read. I read every word. I learned that HOA members have the right to inspect and copy association records, including financial documents, meeting minutes, and contracts with vendors. I learned that the association must provide these records within 10 business days of a written request, and that failure to comply can result in penalties of up to $500 per violation. The Act also outlined clear procedures for challenging improper fines, recalling board members, and demanding independent audits. And I learned something else, something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the ceiling for a long moment. Filing a false police report in California is not a civil matter. It is a felony under Penal Code Section 148.5, punishable by up to 6 months in county jail. I let that sink in. Patricia Vaughn had not simply harassed me, she had potentially committed a crime. The second weapon was paper. On the 4th day, I drafted a formal request for HOA financial records going back 5 years. I cited the specific sections of the Davis-Sterling Act that entitled me to this information. I listed the categories of documents I expected to receive: annual budgets, reserve fund statements, vendor contracts, invoices for any expenditure over $1,000, and minutes from all board meetings, both open and executive sessions. I printed the letter, signed it, and drove to the post office to send it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. I also sent copies to the HOA's registered agent and to the property management company Gregory Vaughn's company. Every recipient would have to sign for the delivery, creating an unimpeachable record of who knew what and when. The third weapon was the body camera footage from that Sunday morning. I filed a public records request with the police department under the California Public Records Act, asking for all video and audio recordings from the officer's visit to my home, as well as the incident report and any written statements provided by the complainant. The department had 10 days to respond. I marked the deadline on my calendar and moved on. Meanwhile, I called an old friend from law school. Anthony King had gone into real estate law while I went to the federal bench, and over the years, he had handled dozens of HOA disputes. I explained the situation without mentioning my suspicions about the financial irregularities. I wanted his unbiased assessment first. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Stephen," he said finally, "you could bury these people. You know that, right, with your background, your connections? You could make one phone call and turn this woman's life into a nightmare." I told him that was not what I wanted. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then do it right. Build your case. Document everything. And for God's sake, don't let them know what you're doing until it's too late for them to stop them." I took his advice. I created a comprehensive tracking system for every interaction with the HOA, a spreadsheet with dates, descriptions, scanned documents, and photographs of my property taken from multiple angles on different days. I kept notes on every conversation with neighbors, recording who seemed sympathetic and who remained loyal to Patricia. The work was tedious, meticulous, and utterly necessary. I was building a fortress of facts, brick by brick, while Patricia believed I was simply an old man too stubborn to submit. That was exactly what I wanted her to believe. But as the days passed, I began to understand something I had not fully considered when I started down this path. If I truly pursued it, with everything I had, my quiet life in Willowbrook Estates would end. The moment I filed a lawsuit or made a formal complaint to a regulatory agency, my name would become part of the public record. Journalists might pick up the story, former colleagues might reach out. The anonymity I had cultivated since my retirement would evaporate, and I would once again become Judge Stephen Caldwell, a public figure whose every action was scrutinized and debated. I had left that life behind for a reason. I was not sure I wanted it back, but I was also not sure I had a choice anymore. On the 7th day, my phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood message board. Someone had created a new post with the subject line, "Warning dangerous individual in our community." I opened it and found my own face staring back at me, a photograph taken at the HOA meeting I had attended, zoomed in and slightly blurred, as if captured by someone trying not to be noticed. The caption read, "This man threatened our volunteers and has been reported to the police. Please be vigilant and report any suspicious activity." The post was signed by Patricia Vaughn, HOA president. Within an hour, it had 47 reactions and 23 comments, most of them expressing alarm and gratitude for the warning. Patricia had just declared war on my reputation, and I realized then that the price of fighting back would not only be my privacy, it would be my dignity, my standing in this community, everything I had hoped to build here. The question was whether I was willing to pay it. The post about me spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Patricia's warning had been shared to every corner of the community, the message boards, the email chains, the group chats where neighbors coordinated package deliveries and reported suspicious vehicles. I watched it happen in real time, refreshing my phone every few hours to see the comment count climb, 50, 75, over 100. Most of the responses were variations on the same theme. "Thank you for keeping us safe. We need to protect our families. Why hasn't this man been arrested yet?" A few voices asked for more details or questioned the lack of evidence, but they were quickly drowned out by the chorus of outrage. Patricia had turned me into a monster, and the community was eager to believe her. The social consequences arrived swiftly. My next-door neighbor, A man named Ted, who had waved to me every morning for 8 months, suddenly found reasons to avoid eye contact. The woman across the street began walking her dog in the opposite direction when she saw me outside. At the small grocery store that served the neighborhood, the cashier who had always asked about my day now processed my purchases in silence, her eyes fixed on the register. I understood their fear. They had been told I was dangerous, and they had no reason to doubt the word of their HOA president. But understanding did not make it easier to bear. I had spent my career protecting the innocent and holding the powerful accountable. Now I was the accused, convicted in the court of neighborhood opinion without ever being given the chance to defend myself. On the 5th day, I walked out to my car and found the word "leave" spray-painted across the driver's side door in bright red letters. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the crude message, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This was not just Patricia anymore. This was the community she had weaponized against me. Someone had walked onto my property in the middle of the night, vandalized my vehicle, and walked away believing they had done a righteous thing. I photographed the damage from multiple angles, noted the time and date, and added it to my documentation file. Then I called a detailing service to have the paint removed. I would not give Patricia the satisfaction of seeing me drive around with her message on display. The following week, Patricia escalated further. A special edition of the HOA newsletter arrived in every mailbox, featuring a prominent safety alert section with my photograph and a summary of the allegations against me. The language was carefully crafted to avoid outright defamation reported to authorities. Under investigation, residents are advised to exercise caution, but the implication was unmistakable. I was a threat to be monitored and avoided. The newsletter also announced an emergency community safety meeting scheduled for this coming Saturday to discuss recent security concerns and protective measures. I was not invited. Patricia was consolidating her narrative, building consensus, ensuring that when the time came for a final confrontation, the entire neighborhood would stand behind her. I considered leaving. The thought crept into my mind late at night, when the house was quiet and the weight of isolation pressed down on me like a physical force. I could sell the house, take whatever loss the market demanded, and start over somewhere else. Somewhere Patricia Vaughn had never heard of. Somewhere I could be anonymous again, just another retiree with a small garden and no enemies. My wife would have understood. She had always been the practical one, the voice of reason when my sense of justice threatened to override my common sense. "Choose your battles," she used to say. "Not every wrong needs to be righted by you." But she was gone now, and her voice had faded to a whisper I could barely hear. I had chosen this neighborhood because it reminded me of the place where we had planned to retire together. Leaving would mean abandoning that dream. It would also mean letting Patricia win, and worse, leaving her free to do this to someone else. On Saturday evening, while the safety meeting was underway at the clubhouse, I heard a soft sound at my front door. Not a knock, something lighter, like paper sliding across wood. I waited several minutes until I was certain the footsteps had retreated, then opened the door to find a plain white envelope on my doormat. No name, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in neat but hurried handwriting, the penmanship of someone whose hands were shaking. "Mr. Caldwell, I know she is lying. I was at that meeting. You were not there. I don't dare speak publicly. She would destroy me the way she's trying to destroy you. But if it ever comes to a courtroom, I will testify to what I know. I'm sorry I can't do more." The note was unsigned, but tucked behind it were several photocopied pages I recognized immediately, vendor invoices from HOA expenditures, the kind of documents I had requested but not yet received. 3 of the invoices listed company names I had never seen on any truck or uniform in the neighborhood: Greenway Infrastructure Solutions, Premier Community Services, and Apex Maintenance Group. The amounts were substantial: $18,000 here, $23,000 there, adding up to well over $100,000 across 2 years. I sat down at my kitchen table and spread the documents out before me. The invoices were detailed, professional-looking, and complete with addresses and tax identification numbers. But something about them felt wrong. I opened my laptop and searched for Greenway Infrastructure Solutions. No website, no business listings. The address led to a P.O. box in a strip mall 15 miles away. Premier Community Services returned similar results: a registered business name with no apparent operations, no employees, and no evidence of actual work performed. I checked the addresses against property records and found vacant lots, empty storefronts, and a storage facility with no connection to landscaping or maintenance. Whoever had created these companies had done just enough to make them look legitimate on paper, but paper was my specialty, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. I picked up my phone and called Anthony King. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. "Stephen, it's almost 11. What's wrong?" I told him I needed a name, someone who specializes in forensic accounting, someone who could trace money through shell companies and fake invoices and find out where it actually went. There was a pause on the line. "Stephen," he said slowly, "what exactly have you gotten yourself into?" I looked at the documents spread across my table, at the evidence of what appeared to be systematic embezzlement from an organization that had spent months trying to destroy my reputation. "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I intend to find out." The 10-day deadline for my document request came and went without a response. On day 11, I sent a second formal request identical to the first, but with two additions. The first was a citation of the specific penalties under the Davis-Sterling Act for failure to produce records up to $500 for each instance of non-compliance, payable directly to the requesting member. The second was a carbon copy notation at the bottom of the letter, indicating that I had sent duplicates to the California Bureau of Real Estate and the State Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. I mailed it certified, as before, and waited. The response came 3 days later, but not in writing. My phone rang at 4 in the afternoon, displaying a number I did not recognize. The voice on the other end identified himself as Robert Harding, legal counsel for the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. His tone was cordial, almost friendly, in the way that lawyers are friendly when they want something. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I'm calling to let you know that the association is prepared to provide you with the documents you requested. There's been some administrative delay, you understand how these things go, but we should have a package ready for you within the week. Some documents, of course, may be redacted for privacy reasons, but I'm confident we can satisfy your concerns." I let him finish, then spoke carefully. "Mr. Harding, partial compliance is not compliance. Redactions require specific legal justification provided in writing, and the 10-day deadline has already passed." There was a pause. When he spoke again, the friendliness had evaporated. "I'll convey your position to the board," he said, and hung up. The body camera footage arrived the following Monday. I had almost forgotten about my public records request to the police department. So much had happened since I filed it, but there it was in my mailbox. A plain manila envelope containing a USB drive and a cover letter explaining the contents. I inserted the drive into my laptop and watched the recording from that Sunday morning, seeing the encounter from Officer Santos's perspective. The footage confirmed everything I remembered Patricia's accusations, my calm response, the boarding pass that proved I could not have been at the meeting she described, but it also captured something I had not fully registered in the moment. When Patricia first approached the officers on my walkway, before I opened the door, she had made a specific claim that went beyond harassment. "He threatened me with a weapon," she said, her voice clear on the audio. "At the meeting last Thursday, he said he had a gun and he would use it if I didn't leave him alone." I watched her say it, watched her expression of righteous fear, and felt something shift in my chest. This was not an exaggeration. This was fabrication, the kind that could have ended with officers arriving weapons drawn, prepared for a dangerous suspect, the kind that gets innocent people killed. I played the footage 3 more times, making sure I understood what I was seeing. Then I saved a copy to my encrypted backup drive and added the original to my evidence file. The forensic accountant Anthony had recommended was a woman named Sandra Chen, a former FBI financial crimes analyst who now worked as a private consultant. I sent her the invoices I had received anonymously, along with my preliminary research on the vendor companies. Her initial assessment arrived within a week, and it confirmed my suspicions. Greenway Infrastructure Solutions, Premier Community Services, and Apex Maintenance Group were all shell companies registered with the state, assigned tax identification numbers, but with no employees, no physical operations, and no evidence of ever having performed any actual work. The addresses on the invoices led to mail drops and vacant properties. The bank accounts associated with each company had been opened within months of each other, and all three had received regular payments from the Willowbrook Estates HOA Reserve Fund. Sandra's preliminary estimate was that at least $270,000 had flowed through these entities over the past 4 years. Where the money went after that, she was still tracing. The instability inside Patricia's kingdom was becoming visible to those who knew where to look. The Tuesday after the safety meeting, the HOA announced that board member Janet Holloway had resigned for personal reasons. Janet was the at-large member, the neighbor whose son Patricia had helped get into private school lot family, not a close friend, just someone who owed Patricia a favor. Her resignation was unexpected and unexplained, and it set off a quiet ripple of speculation among residents who paid attention to such things. A few days later, I overheard a conversation at the mailbox cluster between two women I did not know. One of them was asking why the HOA fees had increased so much over the past few years when nothing in the neighborhood seemed to have improved. The other mentioned that she had tried to get a copy of the annual financial report and had been told it was not available at this time. Small questions, tiny fractures, but fractures spread. On Friday evening, Sandra Chen sent me her final preliminary report. I opened the email expecting more of the same shell companies, missing funds, circumstantial evidence of fraud. What I found instead made me sit very still for a long time. She had traced the wire transfers from the shell company accounts to their final destination. The money, all $270,000 of it, had been deposited into an account belonging to Vaughn Property Management LLC. The sole owner and registered agent of that company was Gregory Vaughn, Patricia's husband. I closed my laptop and stared out the window at the quiet street, at the manicured lawns and the expensive cars and the houses full of people who had no idea what their HOA dues had actually been paying for. Then I picked up my phone and searched for a name I had been saving for the right moment: Reginald Shaw, investigative reporter for the regional newspaper. He had broken stories about local government corruption before. He would know what to do with this. I dialed the number and waited for him to answer. Reginald Shaw was not what I expected. When we met at a coffee shop 2 towns over neutral ground, away from Willowbrook and Patricia's network of informants, I found a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and the kind of careful patience that comes from years of chasing stories that powerful people did not want told. He listened without interruption as I laid out everything: the harassment campaign, the false police report, the shell companies, the money trail leading to Gregory Vaughn. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "You're not just some retiree who got on the wrong side of his HOA, are you?" I told him who I was. I told him I had moved to Willowbrook, seeking anonymity, and found instead a petty tyrant who had mistaken me for easy prey. He nodded slowly, a thin smile crossing his face. "Judge Caldwell," he said, "I think this is going to be a very interesting story." The first article appeared 2 weeks later, on the front page of the regional section. The headline was deliberately understated: "Questions mount over Willowbrook HOA finances." Shaw had done exactly what I asked, presented facts without accusations, raised questions without answering them, and let the evidence speak for itself. He reported that multiple residents had been unable to obtain financial records despite formal requests. He noted the existence of vendor payments to companies with no verifiable operations. He mentioned the recent resignation of a board member and the growing unease among homeowners about where their fees were going. My name appeared only once, identified as a resident who has filed formal complaints with state regulatory agencies. Patricia Vaughn was quoted as defending the HOA's financial practices and dismissing the concerns as baseless attacks by a disgruntled individual. She did not know yet how much I had, or how much more was coming. The reaction in Willowbrook was swift. Some residents rallied behind Patricia, but many more began asking questions they had been afraid to voice before. Within days, a petition demanding financial transparency had gathered over 200 signatures, enough to force an emergency meeting under the association's bylaws. Patricia had no choice but to comply. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the community clubhouse. And for the first time in 6 years, she would face a room full of residents who were not afraid to challenge her. I attended that meeting. I sat in the back row. as I had at the only other meeting I had witnessed, and watched Patricia try to control a room that no longer wanted to be controlled. She began with prepared remarks about the HOA's proud history and commitment to community values. She spoke of the challenges of managing a neighborhood association and the sacrifices made by volunteer board members. She assured everyone that the finances were in order and that a full audit would be conducted in due course. But the room was restless, and the questions came faster than she could deflect them. Where was the reserve fund money? Why had fees increased by 40% with no visible improvements? Who were these vendor companies, and what work had they actually performed? Patricia's answers grew shorter, vaguer, more defensive. Then someone in the middle of the room stood up and asked a question that changed everything. "Mrs. Vaughn, is it true that the man you accused of threatening you is a retired federal judge?" The room went silent. Patricia's face flickered with something I had not seen before: genuine fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its authority. The man continued, "Because I looked him up after reading that article, Judge Stephen Caldwell, and you called the police and told them he threatened you with a gun." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads turned to look at me. I said nothing. I did not need to. The revelation was doing its work without any help from me. The woman who had positioned herself as the protector of this community had tried to have a federal judge arrested on fabricated charges. The absurdity of it, the recklessness, the sheer arrogance it hung in the air like smoke. Patricia tried to regain control. She raised her voice and insisted that I was the one who had been harassing her, that I was using my connections to persecute an innocent woman, that this was all a misunderstanding being blown out of proportion. But she had lost the room. I could see it in the faces around me, the doubt, the anger, the dawning realization that they had been manipulated. One of the remaining board members, a woman named Susan who had barely spoken at any meeting I had attended, stood up and announced that she was resigning effective immediately. Within minutes, another board member followed suit. Patricia sat alone at the front table, her sister and college roommate having quietly slipped out a side door. The meeting dissolved into chaos, and I waited patiently for the room to empty. When the crowd had thinned to a handful of stragglers, I approached the front of the room. Patricia was still sitting at the table, her hands resting flat on its surface as if to steady herself. I had filed a civil lawsuit against her and the HOA 3 weeks earlier, defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The filing triggered automatic discovery obligations, and I had specifically requested all communications between board members and the property management company regarding my account. California's expedited discovery rules for cases involving potential fraud allowed me to compel production within 20 days. Patricia's lawyer, perhaps not realizing what the emails contained, had complied rather than fight a motion that would only draw more attention. And so, I found myself in possession of something she had never intended anyone to see. I placed a single sheet of paper in front of her, a printout of an email she had sent to her husband 6 months earlier. The email discussed how to handle the new resident who was asking too many questions, how to bury him in violations until he either paid up or moved away, and how to use the police if necessary to make him understand that this was her neighborhood. The timestamp on the email predated my first violation notice by 2 weeks. This was not a reaction to anything I had done. This was premeditated. Patricia read it, and I watched the last of her defiance crumble. She had put her intentions in writing, and now that writing would be her undoing, I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving her alone with the ruins of her kingdom. Officer Santos was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against his patrol vehicle with his arms crossed. The evening light had turned golden, casting long shadows across the asphalt. "Judge Caldwell," he said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "I wanted you to hear this from me before it becomes official. The department reviewed the body camera footage from that morning, all of it, including what Mrs. Vaughn said before you opened the door. We're forwarding everything to the district attorney's office. She's likely facing charges for filing a false police report. Given the specific allegations she made about a weapon, it could be charged as a felony." I nodded, absorbing this. "And the financial matters?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The FBI field office has been notified. Wire fraud, mail fraud, and possible embezzlement across state lines. Those are federal crimes. Mr. Vaughn's company has accounts in 3 different states. This is going to get a lot bigger before it's over." I thanked him and got into my car. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, past the manicured lawns and the expensive cars and the houses full of people who were only now learning what their HOA dues had actually been paying for, I thought about what came next. Patricia would face criminal charges. Gregory would face a federal investigation. The HOA would be forced to reform or collapse entirely. Justice, it seemed, was finally arriving. But justice is not the same as resolution. There were still decisions to be made. Choices that would determine not just the outcome of this conflict, but the kind of man I would be when it was over. The system would deliver consequences. The question was what I would choose to add to them. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but once they begin to move, they are difficult to stop. In the weeks following the emergency meeting, Willowbrook Estates transformed from a quiet suburban enclave into the subject of news reports, official investigations, and endless speculation. Patricia Vaughn, who had ruled this community unchallenged for 6 years, now found herself at the center of a storm she could not control. The system I had spent my career serving was doing its work. The district attorney's office moved first. 3 weeks after Officer Santos informed me of the referral, Patricia was formally charged with filing a false police report under California Penal Code Section 148.5. Because her fabricated accusation had involved a weapon, a claim that could have triggered an armed police response, the charge was filed as a felony rather than a misdemeanor. If convicted, she faced up to 3 years in state prison, though her attorney immediately began negotiating for a plea deal that would reduce the charge and avoid incarceration. She was released on her own recognizance, but the conditions of her release prohibited her from contacting me or any witnesses in the case. Gregory Vaughn's situation was more complicated and potentially more serious. The FBI's investigation into the shell companies and fraudulent invoices was still ongoing, but Sandra Chen's forensic analysis had provided agents with a detailed roadmap of the money's movement: wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement, federal crimes that carried sentences measured in years, not months. Gregory had hired a criminal defense attorney from Los Angeles, and word from Anthony King was that he was exploring cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. Patricia had signed off on every fraudulent invoice as HOA president, leaving open the question of whether she had known where the money was actually going. The civil lawsuit I had filed continued on its own parallel track. My attorney had amended the complaint to include the HOA itself as a defendant, along with Patricia in her individual capacity and Gregory's property management company. We were seeking compensatory damages for the harm to my reputation, punitive damages for the deliberate nature of the harassment campaign, and injunctive relief. The discovery process had already yielded the email that had proven so devastating at the meeting. And there was more to come. Patricia's attorney had requested a stay of civil proceedings pending the resolution of the criminal case, but the judge had denied the motion. The pressure on both Vaughns was mounting from multiple directions simultaneously. Reginald Shaw's reporting had attracted attention beyond the regional newspaper. A television station in Los Angeles picked up the story, drawn by the irony of an HOA president who had called the police on a retired federal judge. I declined all requests for interviews, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves, but my name and background were now public knowledge. The anonymity I had sought when I moved here was gone forever. Former colleagues reached out with messages of support. Old friends I had lost touch with called to ask if I was the same Stephen Caldwell they had known decades ago. The quiet retirement I had imagined had been replaced by something else entirely. Within the neighborhood itself, the transformation was profound. A special election was held to fill the vacant board seats, and for the first time in years, there were more candidates than positions. Brenda Gray, the retired accountant who had sent me the anonymous note and the damning invoices, was elected treasurer by an overwhelming margin. The new board's first official act was to commission an independent audit of HOA finances going back 7 years, and to implement term limits along with mandatory public disclosure of all contracts and quarterly financial reports. The rules Patricia had exploited to maintain her power were being rewritten to prevent anyone from doing the same. Patricia herself had become a ghost in her own neighborhood. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks after the arraignment. the for sale sign appearing in the yard like a white flag of surrender. The friends who had once gathered at her annual block parties no longer returned her calls. It was a familiar pattern. I had seen it many times in my courtroom, the way people distance themselves from the powerful once that power has been stripped away. Patricia was learning what it meant to be alone in a community that had once bent to her will. The sentencing hearing for the false police report charge was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late spring. Patricia had ultimately accepted a plea deal, the felony reduced to a misdemeanor in exchange for her guilty plea, with sentencing left to the judge's discretion. The range was probation to 6 months in county jail, and the prosecutor had indicated she would recommend the maximum. As the victim of the false report, I had been asked to submit a victim impact statement describing how Patricia's actions had affected me. The statement would be read aloud in court and would factor into the judge's decision. I had the opportunity to ensure that Patricia faced the harshest possible consequences for what she had done. The night before the hearing, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. I had written victim impact statements before, as a prosecutor early in my career, and I had read hundreds more as a judge. I knew the formula described the harm, quantify the damage, appeal to the court's sense of justice. I could write something that would guarantee Patricia served every day of her potential sentence. She had earned it. She had tried to destroy my reputation, my peace, my sense of safety in my own home. She had weaponized the police against me with lies that could have gotten me killed. I had every right to demand the maximum punishment the law allowed. But as I sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, I heard my wife's voice in my memory, as clear as if she were sitting across from me. Justice is not the same as revenge, she used to say. One heals, the other just spreads the wound. I stared at the blank page for a long time, then I began to write. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I had presided over for 35 years, a municipal facility with fluorescent lighting and plastic chairs. But the principles that governed it were the same: due process and the belief that justice requires not just punishment, but proportion. I sat in the gallery, watching Patricia Vaughn stand before the bench in a gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on her diminished frame. She had lost weight since the HOA meeting. The confident woman who had once commanded this community now looked hollowed out, her eyes fixed on the floor as the judge reviewed her plea agreement. The prosecutor summarized the facts with clinical precision. Patricia had knowingly filed a false police report accusing me of making terroristic threats with a firearm. She had fabricated the incident entirely. The accusation could have resulted in an armed response that endangered lives. The prosecutor recommended the maximum sentence 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. When she finished, the judge turned to me and asked if I wished to read my victim impact statement. I stood and walked to the podium, carrying a single sheet of paper. Patricia's attorney sat rigid, expecting the worst. Patricia herself raised her eyes to meet mine, and I saw something unexpected, not defiance, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had lost too completely to summon anything more. I looked at her, then at my statement, then at the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to speak freely if the court permits." The judge nodded. I set the paper aside. What Mrs. Vaughn did caused real harm. She attacked my reputation. She weaponized the police with lies that could have ended in tragedy. She tried to drive me from my home. I paused. But I spent 35 years on the bench, and I learned that justice is not simply punishment. It is restoration. Mrs. Vaughn has lost her position, her reputation, and her standing. She faces civil liability. Her husband is under federal investigation. The consequences have already been severe. I looked at Patricia again. Her eyes were wet. I am not asking for mercy on her behalf, but I am declining to ask for maximum punishment. I believe probation and community service would serve justice better than incarceration. Mrs. Vaughn has the opportunity to become someone other than the person who tried to destroy me. Whether she takes it is up to her, but I will not be the one who forecloses it. The judge sentenced Patricia to 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. She was prohibited from holding any position of authority in any community organization. She was ordered to pay restitution for my legal costs. As the bailiff led her away, she glanced back at me. I could not read her expression, perhaps gratitude, perhaps simply relief that it was over. 3 months later. I was repairing a section of fence in my front yard when I noticed a figure walking along the opposite side of the street, wearing an orange vest and carrying a trash bag. Community service. I straightened and watched as the figure drew closer. Patricia Vaughn. She was thinner than before, her movements slow and deliberate. She saw me at the same moment I saw her, and we regarded each other across 20 feet of asphalt and months of history. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. After a long moment, she nodded once, a small acknowledgement, nothing more, and continued down the street. I watched until she disappeared around the corner, then returned to my fence. The neighborhood had changed since her departure. Her house had been sold to a young family with 2 children. The new HOA board, led by Brenda Gray, had implemented all the promised reforms. Meetings were democratic, financial reports were transparent. The atmosphere of fear had been replaced by something that felt almost like trust. That evening, I found a letter in my mailbox from the law school where I had taught a seminar decades ago. They were launching a program on ethics and community governance and wanted to know if I would lead a course. The letter mentioned my recent experiences as an example of a real-world perspective. I set it on my kitchen table and looked out the window at the quiet street, at the house I had almost been driven from, at the garage door that remained the same shade of beige it had always been. Nobody complained about it anymore. I picked up the letter and read it again. Perhaps there was still something useful I could do. Perhaps this story did not have to end with survival. Perhaps it could end with something more.